Hey, welcome back to AI Tech Hub. I'm Techie. Today we're diving into the sometimes messy, definitely complex world of container orchestration. We're going to break down two absolute heavyweights in the cloud space, Amazon Elastic Container Service, which you probably know as ECS, and Kubernetes. We're getting right under the hood. We'll look at control planes, task definitions, and your underlying compute options to figure out exactly how these two really stack up.
So let's start with the big question. What exactly is ECS? And, how is it fundamentally different from the Kubernetes ecosystem we've looked at in previous explainers? This isn't just a basic run-of-the-mill feature comparison. It's actually a critical architectural crossroads that, honestly, every single growing engineering team faces at some point. You have to decide where your applications are going to live. In that choice, it usually forces you to pick between maximum open-source flexibility on one hand and highly managed, totally frictionless convenience on the other. Making the wrong call here can literally cost hundreds of hours of engineering time down the road.
To really grasp this difference, let's take a second and recall what we already know about Kubernetes. Think back to our shipping port analogy. Kubernetes acts as this massive, universal, standardized shipping port. It is designed from the absolute ground up to work with literally any shipping company's containers, running seamlessly on absolutely any cloud provider you want. The reason this universal port is so incredibly powerful is its reliance on standardized YAML manifests and a truly massive open-source ecosystem. If you build your application to run on Kubernetes, you're leveraging tools and standards that are understood by millions of developers worldwide. It's basically the ultimate neutral ground for your infrastructure.
Now, ECS takes an entirely different philosophical approach. Instead of a bustling, open, and honestly incredibly complex universal port, think of AWS ECS as a private, exclusive marina. It's this bespoke, beautifully tailored environment built, owned, and run specifically by Amazon Web Services just for their users. In this private marina, the harbor master, which is your control plane, is completely managed for you by AWS, right? Because with Kubernetes, you often have to dedicate serious engineering resources just to maintain the orchestration infrastructure itself, just making sure the port is actually functioning. But with ECS, AWS steps in and handles all of that heavy lifting completely behind the scenes.
So, this analogy really highlights the core architectural divide you have to navigate. Over on one side, you've got the sprawling, standardized, completely vendor-agnostic universal port of Kubernetes. To run that port efficiently, you're usually going to need a dedicated team of highly skilled engineers who really understand its deep complexities just to keep everything moving smoothly. But on the other side, you've got the private marina of AWS ECS. It offers this VIP, highly streamlined experience. You don't need a massive team to manage it because, well, AWS is taking care of the hardest parts. But, and there's always a but, that VIP treatment comes at a very specific cost. You're operating in a closed ecosystem, which means you're sacrificing that broad compatibility you get with Kubernetes.
Now, despite these vastly different operational realities, don't forget that both platforms share the exact same underlying mission: running your Docker containers reliably and doing it at scale. At the end of the day, whether you use the universal port or the private marina, your application is going to run. The real divergence happens in how they pull that mission off. While Kubernetes uses concepts like pods and deployments to manage those containers, ECS introduces an entirely different vernacular and a totally different set of integrations. And honestly, that brings us to some of the most compelling reasons you might actually want to choose the marina.
If you're already building inside the AWS ecosystem, the advantages of ECS are, well, they're deeply compelling. Because it's built in-house by Amazon, it integrates natively and flawlessly with everything else in their catalog. You can easily connect your containers to DynamoDB for incredibly fast database access, or even trigger Lambda functions directly from your ECS events. But perhaps the absolute biggest advantage is how it handles compute power, specifically your choice between EC2 and Fargate. Let's break that down. Think of EC2 as bringing your own boat to the marina. You still have to maintain the underlying servers yourself, doing all the patching and scaling. Fargate, on the other hand, is like just renting engine space. It is entirely serverless compute for your containers. You literally just tell ECS what resources your container needs, and Fargate runs it without you ever provisioning or managing a single underlying server. Combine that with native IAM integration, which gives you incredibly granular task-level security right out of the box, and you have an environment that is genuinely simpler and way faster to set up.
However, choosing a highly specialized, vendor-specific tool does come with a pretty significant caveat. You are effectively trading universal flexibility for that streamlined experience. Bottom line, ECS is significantly less portable. To understand why, we really have to look at how you actually configure your containers. In Kubernetes, you use those standardized YAML files that work pretty much anywhere. In ECS, you use what are called AWS ECS task definitions. These are proprietary JSON files designed specifically for the AWS environment.
They define everything, right? From which Docker image to use, to how much CPU and memory is required, down to which IAM roles the container can assume. And because these task definitions are uniquely tied to AWS, you can't just drag and drop them into another cloud provider. And if your engineering team ever decides to move your infrastructure to another cloud provider, well, the true cost of this lock-in becomes glaringly apparent. Moving cloud providers with Kubernetes is entirely feasible because it works the exact same way everywhere. Your YAML manifests and configurations generally just carry over. But if you try to leave AWS while heavily invested in ECS, you're essentially starting over from scratch. You'd have to completely rewrite all of those AWS-specific task definitions. You'd need to painfully disentangle your applications from native AWS IAM roles and application load balancers, and then somehow translate all of that logic into Kubernetes native equivalents like ingress controllers and role-based access control. That is a massive, massive undertaking, requiring hundreds, if not thousands, of engineering hours.
So you're dealing with the exact same underlying problem, running those containers reliably, but you're weighing completely different strategic trade-offs. Choosing your orchestration tool really just comes down to the true cost of your engineering bandwidth. Opting for the private marina, especially using ECS paired with Fargate, completely removes the burden of managing infrastructure. It frees up your developers to focus purely on writing and shipping code, which is awesome. On the flip side, choosing the universal port of Kubernetes requires significantly more upfront setup and ongoing maintenance, but it acts as an insurance policy. It protects your company's future leverage, making absolutely sure you are never fully at the mercy of a single cloud vendor's pricing or ecosystem.
Ultimately, when designing your system, you have to ask yourself a hard question. Is the dream of true multi-cloud portability a myth that actually costs more in engineering hours than it will ever save you? Or is vendor lock-in a dangerous trap disguised as convenience? Think carefully before you dock your containers. Now, do you want to see ECS actually running real containers? Comment ECS down below. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. If you want to keep learning efficiently, make sure to hit that follow button because we break down a new concept every single episode, and I will see you next time.